When we look at insulin resistance, we say, okay, this is a metabolic situation. So that means it's impacted by what we eat, and that's really the only thing we pay attention to. That makes sense because yes, that metabolic continuum is surrounding nutrients. But our lifestyle can make a big, big change in how our body sees fuel. And that's what we have to look at. It still affects fuel, but our lifestyle can sort of change the lens in which our cells see fuel. And there's some new data that's coming out that's really helping us understand what happens between stress and insulin resistance. For example, we know that stress can increase blood glucose because it's an emergency button, right? When we're stressed out, we hit that emergency button and our body just dumps fuel into the bloodstream in a fight or flight response. That's fairly known, but generally speaking, glucose tends to go back down and kind of gets back into its normal territory soon. But if you start looking at longer term, it really gets scary. There's an interesting study that was published in the journal Metabolism that I want to dive into in just a second. After today's video, check out Thrive Market and you can save 25% off your entire grocery order. I'm not talking like going to the regular like Piggly Wiggly grocery store. I'm talking about going to a grocery store that has things that you want for whatever kind of diet you are doing. It is extremely unique and very, very affordable when it comes down to a lot of their options compared to many grocery stores. Plus, you're not having to spend $6 or $7 per gallon in gas to get to the grocery store to get your groceries. It gets delivered to your doorstep and it makes it that easy. So that link down below saves you 25% off your full entire grocery order. Like that first grocery order, plus you get a free gift along with that order as well. So check them out after this video. So this study was published in the journal Metabolism. It used what is called a cold pressor test. And it sounds funny, but what they did is they took individuals and they had them put their hand in really, really ice cold water. Okay, sounds pretty negligible, right? But what they were looking at was how high did their norepinephrine spike? What kind of spike did they have? Did they have a huge stress response, or were they able to kind of be even keeled and not have a huge stress response? So they calculated this data, and then over an 18-year follow-up, they determined that those that had the higher stress response to this cold pressor test had impaired insulin sensitivity, or more impaired insulin sensitivity. So a higher risk of insulin resistance. This is wild. Now, this is mechanistic. We can look at some more stuff and kind of understand, but there are many correlations between poor sleep, stress, and of course, insulin resistance, because it is a metabolic thing that does communicate with one another. We have to look at this holistically. Sleep affects how our cells see fuel, stress affects how our cells see fuel, and that directly impacts what happens to what is in circulation in terms of glucose. So why is this happening though? We see this correlation here, but it doesn't really pave everything. I like to understand why. And full disclaimer, I'm not a doctor. I'm some guy on the internet, but I know how to read a paper or two. So when I look at this, it makes some sense. When we are stressed out, we have what is called an alpha adrenergic vasoconstriction. Now, what I want you to think of is something like this. You have a sink, and this sink is your circulatory system, like a kitchen sink. And in this kitchen sink, you fill it up with glucose, but in this case, it's water. You fill the sink up with water, and we're gonna pretend that that's glucose. Well, your muscle is like a drain. And if you have a small amount of muscle with a small amount of blood flow, you just have to wait for that glucose to go down that one drain. But if you have a large amount of muscle with a large amount of blood flow, you have like 20 different drains, and that glucose can drain really fast. So I always like to say your muscle is like a glucose sink. It catches the glucose and it stores it and it drains it out. So you might be thinking, what does this have to do with like vasoconstriction? What does this have to do with stress? Well, I'm not necessarily saying you need to go build a bunch of muscle, although that does help. But when you are vasoconstricted, when your blood vessels are constricted because of stress, you have less perfusion, less tissue perfusion, less ability to get the glucose that is in your bloodstream circulating into the nooks and crannies of your muscles to dispose of said glucose. So that constriction makes it so that glucose can ultimately stay higher, which clearly is not a good thing. The glucose is circulating high, that's going to trigger next up, insulin release, and that's going to cause all that issue, right? So what happens after you eat a meal? Well, normally when you eat a meal, you have a postprandial vasodilation. you have an increase in blood flow. And this is normal because you are having an increase in digestion, you're having an increase in nutrient delivery, you're having amino acids that are getting delivered, glucose that's getting delivered as a result of consuming a meal. But if you're stressed, then the vasoconstriction is going to sort of override that postprandial vasodilation, meaning the sugar that's coming in is going to stay elevated with nowhere really to go. Now, this is one side of the equation, right? You couple this with continually being stressed and your body having sort of a skewed insulin to glucagon response where more glucose is being released out of the bloodstream. So now you have this postprandial glucose that wasn't able to get drained, so you're already elevated. Then you have a stress response that is triggering more glucose to be on top of that. So your glucose can really go sky high. So that's why a lot of times when you're stressed out and you consume carbohydrates, you get a really high spike, more so than you ordinarily would. Like, for example, I wear a continuous glucose monitor, so I watch this all the time. If I did not sleep well, or if I'm extra stressed and I go eat some carbohydrates, which ironically enough, when I'm stressed out is the time that I want carbohydrates, I get an extra large spike. Like usually for me, it's like 20 to 30% more than what I would normally get. Some people, even more than that. So you have to look at these ways to modulate stress the best that you can. And I go back to that cold pressor test. That was measuring the norepinephrine response, right? Theoretically, if you were an even-keeled person that maybe, let's just hypothetically say, even practiced meditation and was really good at attenuating your stress response when a stressor hits you, you could control your breath, you could control some of these catecholamine responses that actually mitigate that norepinephrine response. You cannot always change the stressor, but you can change your perception of a stress. And this is where it's really important. And I go back to that famous psychologist, Angela Duckworth, who had talked about that specifically, where she had said, your perception of stress is more important than the stress itself. You have distress and you have eustress, going back to some of Tim Ferriss's old talk, right? Eustress is stress, but it's good stress, but it's still stress. Distress is stress, but it's bad stress. And how you perceive it can really change the paradigm in how you respond to stress in the future. If you start skewing your perception of stress to being this terrible thing all the time, I'm stressed out, I'm frazzled, that's gonna be a problem because then you actually do have this huge response. But if you see it in a positive way where, okay, this is some stress, I'm gonna roll with the punches, I'm gonna deal with it, that creates a positive impact. And that is something that I needed to hear to be able to understand, if I can just control my response to stress, I can metabolically control the situation, potentially a little bit better. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.